I didn't want to believe it at first. I told myself maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was just someone passing by. But the second time I saw her, phone raised, standing behind the trees on the other side of my fence, something changed in me, because she wasn't just out for a walk. She wasn't admiring the landscaping. She was aiming her phone at my kids right there. In my backyard, my 8-year-old daughter was blowing bubbles. My son was chasing them barefoot in the grass. It was one of those rare quiet afternoons where time slows down just enough to feel normal, until I caught someone from the HOA board taking pictures of them from behind the bushes. I walked fast to the back gate, heart pounding, hands shaking. By the time I opened it, she was already walking away, like she hadn't just violated the one thing that matters most to me. "Excuse me," I called out. "Were you just taking photos?" She turned with that fake surprised face, like she didn't know what I was talking about. Then she gave me the line that set everything off. "Just documenting violations, that's what we're required to do." Violations? In my backyard? Behind a 6-foot fence? I asked her who gave her permission to photograph my children without my knowledge. She didn't answer that part. She just smiled, and smug and slow, and walked off down the path behind the houses. That night, I didn't sleep, because I knew this wasn't about a lawn chair or a garden hose. This was about privacy. This was about control. This was about a group of people who thought HOA rules gave them the right to do whatever they wanted, even if it meant creeping around behind fences and photographing families without consent. So I started making calls, not to the board, to law enforcement, because if they were willing to target my kids with a camera, they weren't just breaking the rules, they were crossing the law, and I wasn't about to let that slide. We moved into that neighborhood because it felt safe. That was the whole point. Good schools, tree-lined streets, neighbors who waved from across the yard, the kind of place where you let your kids ride bikes without watching the clock, where barbecues happened on Sundays, and everyone kept their lawns a little too clean. It was a planned community, which meant, of course, an HOA came with the package. At first, it didn't bother me. The dues weren't outrageous, and the handbook was mostly common sense. Keep your lawn trimmed, don't paint your house neon green, don't block the sidewalks. Fine, I could live with that. I even went to the first couple of meetings just to get a feel for things. That's where I first saw her. Let's call her Marcia, HOA board secretary. Always had a clipboard in one hand and a smartphone in the other. The kind of person who seemed to enjoy catching people doing something wrong. But still, I didn't think much of it. We kept to ourselves. My wife ran a small business from home. I worked regular hours. Our kids, 8 and 6, spent most afternoons in the backyard, under the big oak tree that shaded half the lawn. We'd put up a tall, privacy fence when we moved in. Not because we were hiding anything, just because we liked feeling like we had our own space, a boundary between us and the world. It was a good life, until the letters started showing up. The first one was about unauthorized play structures. It meant the plastic kiddie slide tucked behind the tree. The second said we'd violated backyard visibility standards, whatever that meant. Apparently our patio umbrella was non-conforming. Then came a warning about excessive noise during unsanctioned outdoor activities. That was our kids laughing. At first I shrugged it off. I figured some rule stickler didn't like the sound of children being children. I sent polite responses. I asked for clarification. I even offered to move the slide out of sight. But then the photos started showing up with the letters, grainy images, clearly taken through or over. The fence is showing our backyard, our patio, our kids' toys. That's when my patience started to fray. I asked the HOA how these photos were being taken. Who authorized them? Where were they being stored? Were they being shared? No answers. Just another notice. Another blurry photo. And then that day in the yard, where I caught her, Marcia, hiding by the bushes, phone up, focused, watching my kids. That changed everything. Because I can tolerate a lot of things. Noise complaints, nitpicky letters, even HOA meetings full of passive-aggressive sighs. But you start photographing my children without my consent. That's no longer a community issue. That's a legal one, and I was going to treat it that way. The next morning, I filed a police report, not a complaint, not a concern, a report. Because when someone steps onto the edge of your property, hides behind your fence, and points a camera at your children, that's not community management, that's surveillance, and I wasn't going to let it slide just because someone wore a name tag and sat behind a folding table once a month. The officer I spoke to didn't dismiss me. In fact, the moment I showed him the letters, and especially the photos, he sat up straighter. "Do you know who took these?" he asked. "I do," I said. "Her name is Marcia, HOA board secretary. I caught her doing it myself." "Did she enter your property?" "She was behind the fence, but close, probably on the utility strip. Still aimed the phone directly into my yard, at my kids. He didn't make a promise, but he nodded and said, 'We'll follow up. You did the right thing reporting this.'" It felt good to hear that, because when you're dealing with HOA nonsense, it's easy to feel like you're the problem. Like questioning them makes you the difficult one, but not this time. This time, they crossed the line. I also wrote a formal letter to the HOA board that afternoon, not an email. A certified, signed, dated letter. "This is to notify you that I have reported an HOA board member for potential privacy violations, including unauthorized photography of minors on private property. Any further attempts to document violations inside our enclosed yard, particularly those involving our children, will be treated as harassment and referred directly to law enforcement. All future HOA communication regarding this matter is to be submitted in writing only." I attached a copy of the police report number. 2 days later, I received a response. Not from Marcia, from the board president. "The HOA is committed to upholding community standards and denies any wrongdoing in this matter. We reserve the right to document violations visible from public areas. However, we will instruct board members to avoid areas that might be misconstrued as invasive." Misconstrued. That's the word they chose. As if watching my kids through a fence and taking pictures was just a misunderstanding. That letter made my blood boil. Not because they denied wrongdoing, I expected that, but because they still didn't seem to realize how serious this had become. So I forwarded their response to the police, and within 72 hours, Marcia got a knock on her door. I don't know exactly what was said, but I know this. She resigned from the board by the end of the week. Her clipboard walks stopped, the complaint letters gone, the camera put away, and for the first time in months, peace returned to our backyard. The silence was instant. After Marcia's resignation, it was like the HOA had gone on mute. No new letters, no follow-up about our umbrella, no complaints about play, structure violations. It was as if someone had hit pause on the entire enforcement machine. And honestly, that silence was louder than anything they could have said, because it meant they knew they'd pushed too far. They'd played the wrong game with the wrong family, and now they were hoping it would all just disappear. But things don't just disappear, especially not in a neighborhood where fences are only 6 feet tall and gossip flows faster than the irrigation system. Within a week, people started asking questions. A neighbor across the street, someone I'd barely spoken to before, came over while I was raking leaves. "Hey," he said, "is it true you had to call the police on the HOA?" I didn't dodge it. I told him the truth. They were taking photos of my kids. That's a line I don't let anyone cross. He didn't flinch. "Good. Someone needed to say something. We've been dealing with their garbage for years." Turns out we weren't the only ones. Another neighbor 2 doors down said she'd gotten flagged for leaving a car window cracked during summer. Someone else was cited for improper shade angles on their patio umbrella. But nobody ever fought, back but until now. And once word got around that I had involved the police and that it worked, something shifted. People started showing up to board meetings again, not just to sit, to speak, to ask questions, to remind the board they don't run a kingdom. At the next meeting, I wasn't even planning to go, but a neighbor texted me, "You might want to be here. They're changing how violations are handled." I showed up late, stood in the back. The board president read through a series of changes, all said with that neutral tone they use when they want to seem calm while retreating. All board members would now be required to submit photo documentation through an official channel. Photos of minors were no longer permitted under any circumstance. Violations inside fenced backyards would require 2 written complaints from adjacent neighbors before being investigated. And finally, board members will refrain from entering or monitoring areas not deemed public property or visibly accessible from common space. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't even speak. I just listened, because I didn't need an apology. I got something better. I got change. Change that would outlast me. Change that meant the next parent wouldn't have to stand on their porch with a violation letter and feel helpless. And as I left that meeting, I passed a few familiar faces. They didn't say much, but their nods said everything. A silent kind. Of thanks. A shared kind of understanding. One person stood up, and it reminded everyone else that they could too. Let's talk about what really matters here, because whether you live in an HOA or not, there are lines no one is allowed to cross. And privacy is one of them. When I filed that police report, I wasn't just being dramatic. I was protecting my family. And the truth is, you have legal rights when it comes to your home, your yard, and especially your children. So here's what you need to know. 1. Photographing people, especially minors, on private property laws vary by state. But there are a few clear standards across the board. If someone is on private property, like your fenced backyard, and another person is photographing them without consent, it can be considered an invasion of privacy. If that person is a minor, especially a child under the age of 13, the legal protections get even stronger. In most states, photographing children without parental permission, particularly in a private setting, can trigger investigations for harassment or even predatory behavior, regardless of the photographer's intent. That's why the officer didn't hesitate, because HOA board or not, a camera pointed at kids without a parent's consent is never okay. 2. HOAs are not above the law. This is where people get confused. Just because someone holds a clipboard and says policy doesn't mean they can ignore actual laws. HOA boards have authority over community rules, but that does not include entering private property without permission, taking photos inside enclosed or fenced areas, documenting residents in private spaces, monitoring children without parental knowledge. In legal terms, this crosses into surveillance or invasion of privacy depending on the situation, and if a board member does it, they can be held personally responsible, not just the HOA. 3. What to do if this happens to you. If you ever catch an HOA board member, or anyone, taking pictures of your yard, family, or children, document the incident. Date, time, who was involved. Take your own photo or video of the person doing it if it's safe to do so. Report it to the HOA in writing. Certified mail if possible. File a police report if minors were involved, or you believe there was trespassing or harassment. Check your state's privacy and surveillance laws. This isn't about overreacting. It's about setting boundaries, because the moment you stay silent, they assume it's allowed. 4. The power of one written letter. What worked? In my case, wasn't shouting. It wasn't threats. It was a calm written letter backed by a police report and the law. That's what made them blink. That's what made them change policy. So don't underestimate the power of being quiet, but prepared. Bottom line, your yard is your space. Your family is not public property, and your HOA isn't allowed to monitor you like you're on trial. Know your rights, stand your ground, and never let a clipboard convince you otherwise. I didn't realize how much tension I'd been carrying until it was gone. That week, after the new policy changes went into effect, our house felt different, lighter, quieter. My kids played in the yard again, without me constantly glancing toward the fence, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was being watched. The HOA never apologized, of course. No one knocked on my door, no official acknowledgement, no letter admitting wrongdoing, but they didn't have to, because they changed everything. The very next newsletter, which I read twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it, included a full paragraph about respecting resident privacy, and that board members should avoid photography of enclosed private spaces. That was their way of folding. Softly, silently, but folding nonetheless. And then came the ripple effects. People who had been quiet for years started speaking up, not just about privacy, but about everything else the board had been quietly enforcing. The uneven fines, the surprise fees, the citations that only seemed to target certain homes. At the next meeting, attendance doubled, and not a single resident came just to listen. They came with questions, with concerns, with their own letters, their own printed documents. I didn't speak that time. I sat in the back, and I watched the board squirm under the same kind of pressure they'd once used on us. It wasn't revenge. It was balance. For the first time in years, the homeowners remembered that the HOA works for them, not the other way around. And the neighborhood? It started to feel like home again. We hosted a small birthday party for my daughter 2 weeks later. Nothing huge, and just a couple of her friends, some cake, a folding table with balloons. She played tag barefoot across the lawn, while music played quietly from the patio speaker, and not a single complaint showed up afterward. Not one note, not one letter, just the sound of kids laughing, and no one trying to make them stop. I still keep the violation letters in a folder, alongside the police report, and a printout of the state's privacy laws, not out of spite, out of principle, because they remind me of what happens when good people stay silent, and what happens when just one voice says, "Not this time." I didn't go looking for a fight. I just wanted to raise my kids without feeling like I was under surveillance, and in standing up for that right, I gave others permission to do the same. So, no, I never got an apology, but I got something better. Boundaries, respect, and peace. Earned, not given. If you've made it this far, let me tell you something important. You are not powerless. It doesn't matter how many letters they send. It doesn't matter if your HOA board has meetings or handbooks or 1,000 policies in small print. Because once they start overstepping boundaries, especially when it comes to your privacy, your kids, your yard, you have every right to push back. And the moment you do, everything changes. 1. HOA rules. Do not override. Basic rights. HOA board members are not police. They're not judges. They are volunteers, or sometimes paid managers, who enforce community guidelines. But those guidelines can never override the law. If they try to photograph your private yard, monitor your children, or enter spaces not open to the public, they are crossing a legal line. And when that happens, you don't ask, you tell. 2. Use the power of paper. Here's exactly what I did, and what you can do too. Document everything. Dates, times, photos, screenshots of violation letters. Send all complaints in writing. Certified mail is best. It leaves a paper trail they can't ignore. Get your state's privacy laws. Print them. Highlight them. File a police report if someone is taking pictures of your children or stepping too close to your home. That's not overreacting. That's protecting your family. One written letter backed by law can do more than a dozen angry emails ever could. 3. Don't let shame keep you silent. That's how HOAs operate sometimes, by making people feel like they must have done something wrong. But here's the truth. There is nothing wrong with children playing in their own yard. There is nothing wrong with a patio umbrella, a plastic slide, or a bubble machine. And there is absolutely something wrong with someone photographing your children without consent. You are not overreacting. You are setting a boundary. And that's what HOAs don't expect. 4. One voice starts a chain reaction. The moment I pushed back, neighbors started speaking up. Why? Because everyone was feeling it. They just didn't think they were allowed to say anything. But one voice changes everything, and you can be that voice. 5. HOA power depends on silence. Break that pattern. You don't need to yell. You don't need to fight dirty. You just need to know your rights, speak calmly, and refuse to be intimidated. And when you do, that little clipboard loses a lot of its power. So if your HOA ever crosses the line, don't panic, don't fold, don't wait, document, speak, act, because this is your home and nobody gets to take your peace away without hearing from you first. I never wanted to be the person who had to make a scene, never wanted to be the name they whispered about at board meetings, never wanted to file reports or quote laws or draw lines in the dirt. I just wanted to raise my family in peace, to hear my kids laugh in the backyard without wondering who might be watching, to build a life behind a fence that meant privacy, not a target, to feel like home was still mine even if I shared a zip code with a board full of rules. But sometimes the fight finds you anyway, and when it does, you don't get to back down. Not when it's your kids, not when it's your safety, not when someone mistakes your silence for weakness. That day I saw her, crouched behind the bushes, phone up, camera pointed. I stopped being polite. I stopped writing carefully worded replies. I stopped waiting for someone else to fix it, and I became the voice they didn't expect to hear. Not loud, not angry, just certain, because the truth is, people who abuse rules don't fear chaos. They fear clarity. They fear someone who knows exactly where the line is and dares to say you've crossed it. And once that happens, everything starts to shift. Neighbors speak up. Rules get rewritten. And the clipboard that once ruled the block suddenly feels a lot lighter in their hands. So if you're watching this thinking, that would never happen here, let me ask you, what would you do? If one day your child was in the backyard and someone from the board decided that was a violation, would you stay silent or would you stand? Because I can tell you this, the only thing scarier than someone crossing your line is when no one tells them to stop. So let this story be your reminder. Your family's peace is not a violation. Your kids' laughter is not a rule break. And your privacy is not optional, no matter what the HOA thinks. If this happened to you, as would you have called the police? Tell me in the comments, because you deserve to feel safe, not just inside your home, but in your own yard.